Yo, what's up boys and girls, it's your boy Swolelax here, and I'm back at it again with another video, this time something just a little bit different. Today, let's try to answer a question. The topic of today's discussion is nothing new. It's nothing that you haven't seen before, it's nothing that you haven't experienced yourself, and probably you guys have a lot to say about this as well. This kind of subject has been toying around in my mind for just a little bit now, especially with the most recent changes and the most recent metagame that has been developing inside of Yu-Gi-Oh! Over the past year, maybe year and a half. I more recently have been feeling the heavy effects of this as it's been affecting my own play, and so I wanted to talk about this as an experiment, not only to see what you guys think, but also just to get some things off of my chest. If you guys like this discussion, please let me know and hit that subscribe button. It really does help out the channel. But with all that being said, let's talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! And how gosh dang expensive it is. Is Yu-Gi-Oh! Getting more expensive? The answer will shock you. It's yes, the answer is yes. We could just end the discussion there, but I want to take time and discuss how we got here and why Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so expensive at the moment. It doesn't always have to be this way, and it hasn't always been this way, and I want to explore that with you guys. So to understand how we got here, we have to go back to a dark and depressing time, but also a very beautiful moment inside of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history. Journey with me as we reminisce about TOS format. TOS format, or TOSS, was roughly 2018 to honestly about 2020 inside of Yu-Gi-Oh! It is considered to be by many one of the more recent formats, you know, similar to how we say GOAT or Edison or any of the past formats. Like TOS is a predefined metagame, and we do have retrospect to say that now. It's been about 3 to 4 years since that meta's really been developed, so it's kind of nostalgic for some people. But dubbed the Eternal format because it lasted for so long, TOS stands for Thunder, Orcust, Striker, and Salad. Those last two are interchangeable. These were the top 4 decks that were plaguing the metagame, and essentially if you were not playing these top 4 decks, everything else was considered rogue or under. So it kind of sounds like a bad time and that the meta was not necessarily super diverse, but I will say that other decks also performed pretty well. Things like Altergeist or Pendulums were still out there. The top 4 decks specifically had interesting meta play between the top 4 decks in themselves, with different counters naturally occurring inside of each deck, different tech options being available not only within the tech itself, but also outside cards that you would bring in to help prepare yourself for worse or better matchups that you could face. I played a lot in this format and I have a lot of thoughts and opinions when it comes to how this format has shaped the current metagame and eventually future Yu-Gi-Oh! But why is this important to the cost of today's Yu-Gi-Oh! How does TOS impact the expensiveness of Yu-Gi-Oh! Now? Well, I would argue this time period inside of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history was also more recently one of the most budget-friendly metas in the entirety of the game. The Eternal format 2018 into 2019, more specifically in my opinion, had a lot of great budget options, and the engines for the top decks and even some of the rogue decks were very affordable and very accessible to many players. Excluding one of the top decks of the format, most of them you could find for fairly cheap to cheap, just like straight up like structure decks. In order from most expensive to least expensive, we had Thunder Dragon, Sky Striker, Orcust, and Salad. Orcust and Salad are interesting and more prominent in my opinion because these two were very low rarity. You could find the cards pretty accessibly because a lot of times, like in Orcust's case, the cards came in commons or rares, or they also came in super rares, like again, very low rarity up until Dingirsu. And the Soul Burner structure deck featuring the Salamangreats reprinted one of the most sought after powerful hand traps of all time. Uncommon rarity, no less. So you have this case where the upper echelon of decks are ruled by these low rarity, very affordable decks, and then right below that, you have a lot of rogue decks, and including some things like Pendulum that were really easy to build and crazy easy to find. For the sake of argument later, sure, we had things like Sword Dragon, Dingirsu, certain hand traps like Infinite Impermanence, and removal spell and trap cards like Evenly Matched. These cards were all pretty pricey and were definitely used at the top levels of play. However, a lot of times these cards were not required and the budget alternatives for these cards did suffice. Some decks even opted for budget alternatives to things like Sword Dragon and Imperm for budget options that worked just as good, if not better. The counterplay inside of this format was also pretty good, and the card pool, more recent reprints, and other tech options that were more readily available were uniquely suited to handle this metagame. Most of the generic stuff that you would want was either reprinted, easy on the wallet, and better yet, interchangeable with other things. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because currently, That is not the case. Deck engines and deck cores are way more expensive, especially for the best decks. I'm looking at you, Sword Soul. It's not just Sword Soul. More recently, we had the Dogmatica stuff. Before that got reprinted, we also have upcoming the Brave engine. Eldlik was way too expensive before reprints. And then even just as more recently as stuff like Dinosaurs, but it's not just deck cores and specific decks that are way more expensive. The formed metagame that we are in right now, the types of cards that would be good either to combat the metagame or tech options that you want to put inside your deck, or even then, generic staples that you might need, are also really expensive. The types of decks that are really good right now are pretty non-interactive, so blowout cards are necessary. But what's unfortunate about them being necessary is that they're also expensive. Cards like Lightning Storm, evenly matched, is still pretty expensive. Forbidden Droplets, Dragoon and DPE, and finally Axis Code Talker, which yes, more recently got a reprint, but is still pretty pricey. Again, it's not just the blowout cards or meta-specific stuff, also staple cards that you would need for further deck building or casual play. Things like Nibiru, Drone Lockbird is insanely priced. All the pot cards like Prosperity and Extravagance. Infinite Impermanence is better, but still kind of up there. And even the common Ash Blossom is insane. You can argue to say that some of the blowout cards or the deck engine stuff you can kind of replace or be a little more budget friendly with, and I can agree to that. But the deck staples are almost non-negotiable. These cards are not only requirements for playing inside of the meta of Yu-Gi-Oh, but pretty much for playing modern Yu-Gi-Oh in general. But Swolelax, why don't you just play a rogue deck? Here's what's even crazier, it's not just the meta cards. Rogue decks and things that are right below the meta are also crazy expensive. Have you looked at hero prices recently? This card just got reprinted. And most budget and rogue decks might as well be casual because in general, these decks can't compete right now with the better top echelon of decks. Whereas before, that was not necessarily the case. And sure, you could tech out your rogue deck to have a better chance on the metagame, but those things are also expensive. So when your deck's expensive for your rogue deck, even arguably more expensive than your meta deck, and then the staples are expensive, what do you do? So we've arrived at this scenario where previous top meta contenders were a little more budget friendly, even up until somewhat recently where Zodiac still had Trident and is like Eldlik Zoo. There were some budget options inside of there, and Drytron arguably could be considered budget because some of the cards were in lower rarity. But even then, the staples and some of the deck cores were really expensive, and it's not just the high rarity stuff. Yu-Gi-Oh is what you make of it for sure. There are cheaper options for cards, and that does mean sacrifice in terms of viability. For example, like I said in TOS format, whenever you use something like Effect Veiler versus Infinite Impermanence, sure, they somewhat do the same thing, but Infinite Impermanence is clearly the better card. Or we could even go further back in things like Solemn Strike when that was really expensive, or Pot of Desires. Like I said, sure, there is an argument to be made about the competitive nature of some of these replacements, but when the disparity between the replacement and the real thing are just so wide, that's when we start to see this kind of divide. In previous formats, you probably could get by with something like Effect Veiler versus Imperm, but you can't really do that right now, at least not at an affordable price. And maybe this just means we've entered a new era of power creep. I mentioned before things like Solemn Strike and Pot of Desires, where like 2016 and 2017 format, right before TOS format, I'm talking like right before, things like Ash Blossom and Solemn Strike, Pot of Desires, these were all super expensive. And there was almost no replacement for these cards. There really wasn't. But right after that, we did start seeing more budget-friendly options become more viable. We started seeing more reprints of these cards. And not only reprints, but accessible reprints, like Desires was a promo inside the Megaton, so everyone had access to it. Ash Blossom was a common in a structure deck. Everyone had access to it. Solemn Strike was a promo card in special editions, which, yeah, you had a percentage chance of not getting it, but for the most part, really accessible. So maybe we're just on the cusp of having more budget-friendly options, not only in terms of meta staples, but also in terms of meta decks. Maybe it really does come and go with inside of Yu-Gi-Oh! With things like online simulators, you could play Yu-Gi-Oh! At a $0 budget if you really wanted to. And while I personally am probably putting way too much stock inside of Master Duel, maybe that's going to help solve the problem of making cards and meta decks just more accessible in an official format. And before we end all this, I do want to say I'm going to be exploring more of how Konami has given power to the players. How they've used certain tactics and done certain things with certain powerful cards to give more agency and more budget-friendly options to the players. We do have historical context for it, and I would love to make a video on this. If you guys want to see that, or if you guys like this video, make sure to leave it a like. And if you want to see more, please subscribe. I have a lot more videos coming in the pipeline, so stay tuned for that if you'd like to. But yeah, what do you guys think of it? What do you guys think of budget options inside of Yu-Gi-Oh? What do you guys think of it being really expensive? Do you guys think it's just fine? You tell me. What are your thoughts and opinions? You've already heard mine. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.